Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the Press Club with me, Kendall Burton, my co-host Earl Buske, where we review the big stories making news each and every week, the day's newspapers, as well as issues affecting the media. We start with today's newspaper, The Voice. Well, all the newspapers carry this, basically the same headline story this week. The Voice newspaper, US $2.6 billion project for Viewfort. Also, the Star newspaper, $1 billion smiles. And the other headline, SLP still gunning for ex-sister Sarah. The Mirror newspaper, of course, referencing that same project, US $2.6 billion investment for St. Lucia. Now, of course, we have the regular inserts, the Tonight magazine and Sports and Health from the Star newspaper, and the Yo magazine from the Voice newspaper. The Voice is also carrying an Emancipation Day supplement, celebrating Emancipation Day, August 1st, 1838 to 2016.
And staycation is free.
Where do you want to start? What big stories stuck out in your mind this week?
Well, from what you just said there, Kendall, it would appear the only thing that happened in the past week was that the $2.6 billion project for Viewfort. Obviously,
but I guess by the sheer amount of money involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big project for St. Lucia. It's not as much about which government signs the agreement as what it means for St. Lucia, what it means for Viewfort. I think it is a restatement of the fact that investors have more confidence in St. Lucia now than they did 5 years ago, that investor confidence has returned. This is one of several projects. The Citizenship by Investment project 2 weeks ago signed another major project. There's the other one in Choiseul that's coming. There's the Black Bay project. So there are quite a few of them. One of the concerns, immediate concerns, which I think is not the first time I'm going to be saying it, is with the two major mega projects that the last administration and the last Prime Minister had in mind. One, the $150 million Shock to Groseley highway project, which would spill off into every other community that feeds off that highway. The money is there, the project is approved, and it's just a matter of determining when to start. The other one, which is still an idea, but for which quite a lot of money has already been spent, is the proposed highway from Babono to Dennery on the East Coast. The Caribbean Development Bank has in fact committed quite a lot of money towards the feasibility study, and all I have heard in terms of why we should not be progressing seems to stem from the fact that those were the pet projects of the previous or the last Prime Minister. One is only hoping that that is just post-election expression, but that we see the importance of continuing with the Castries to Groseley highway, because the money has been allocated by the QAT Fund and other international donors. The plans are there. The subcontractors and contractors have been lined up. The project proposals in terms of every road from Bonte all the way to Marisil and Tuya, all the way back down the intermediary roads. It also includes a number of bypasses, highway overway passes. The project would also include expanding of the highway in many areas, which would result in acquisition of private properties, which quite a few property owners have been looking forward to. So quite a lot has happened on that project, and one can only hope that it continues.
Yeah, but speaking of continuing projects, what's your take on this incident in Soufrière, where the Prime Minister abruptly stopped the development of the Soufrière Square?
Well, that's a worrying trend. One hopes it doesn't develop into a trend, because again, it is easy to conclude that the Prime Minister stopped that project simply because it was a pet project of the previous administration. It was started by the previous administration. One of the things he was reported as saying is that he's stopping it because he doesn't know where he's going to get the rest of the money. I did read somewhere a response by the leader of the opposition indicating that, contrary to the impression that there is no money, that some $12 million was allocated to that project. It is budgeted for. Some $3 million have been budgeted for the current financial year, which ends in April, and that so far less than $1 million has been spent, which means that there's just in the region of $2.5 million available for continuation of works. So insofar as what the Prime Minister has been reported as having said as being the reason, if that is all he said and offered as a reason, then there is reason to worry, because it would appear that he has not accepted or understood that contracts between governments and contractors are not between ministers of infrastructure or prime ministers and their friends, but between the government of St. Lucia and the contractors involved. Now, these contracts involve exit clauses, which, if there is an agreement to deliver the project within a certain time, and it is stopped, and that stoppage is going to affect the ability of the contractor to deliver on time, then there is an exit clause that can be invoked, through which the Treasury, i.e. the taxpayer, would have to pay more money to the contractor by virtue of the losses suffered by the contractor if the project is discontinued or not allowed to continue to be delivered within the time he or she is contractually obligated to deliver. So, and again, if investors are thinking of following those who have recently come to establish projects, and they feel that they have the uncertainty as to whether the project will be stopped as a result of a change of government, then that limits their willingness to choose to come to St. Lucia if they could get a guarantee elsewhere that a change of government will not, as it should not.
But is the issue really the stoppage of the work, or the manner in which it was done? Because I remember Kenny Anthony saying publicly he has had to stop projects because he was not sadufied with the way things were being done.
But it's the way. This is on-site stoppage. During a visit, the cabinet was in Soufrière. On that day, the Prime Minister visited the project and decided on site immediately, with immediate effect, to stop it. That's not how it is done. A decision is taken in the case in which the Minister of Finance at the time, Prime Minister Kenny Anthony, when he made references to the projects you're referring to, he had made an assessment with the ministry, and they took a decision which was communicated. But this, as far as what was reported, was the Prime Minister saying, hello, stop work now.
But one would imagine, if you're going to do a tour, you know specifically what sites you're going to visit, that you'll be briefed in advance on what those projects are. You would have reviewed any contracts or design plans for the project. You know, so the question comes up now, you know, who's advising the Prime Minister?
Well, you see, the thing, I don't think the Prime Minister went to Soufrière to visit that project. I remember he brought his cabinet down. Soufrière was a constituency he tried unsuccessfully to represent. And here he was going back for the first time as Prime Minister. I think Soufrière, there must be a reason why he chose Soufrière as the first constituency that he would take the entire cabinet to. So there must have been a reason, an overriding reason or an underlying factor as to why Soufrière was the first. Other constituencies, all others are saying they hope they do the same.
Maybe it's touristic value?
Well, you know, we'll get to that. But certainly the point you make about who's advising him, in situations like that, I don't think he's being advised. And clearly, I mean, who would advise a prime minister to take such reckless action?
We're due for a break. Let's take it. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation, our review of some of the stories making the news. This is the Press Club. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Press Club. We're reviewing some of the stories in today's newspapers. Let's turn our attention to the second headline in the Star newspaper. The SLP still gunning for ex-sister Sarah. And while we're at it, we can talk about this issue with the Deputy Speaker position. Now that she has been offered a ministerial post, obviously she's had to step down as a speaker, Deputy Speaker. Neville Snack has an interesting article on that issue in today's Star newspaper on page 6, where he, I should go to the end of the article, where he says, well, he's looking at the issue of the opposition stance on the issue, that electing a deputy speaker from its ranks is not in his best interest. And he's suggesting from the top of the article, you know, that he doesn't see why there's a need for a debate. You know, when it comes to the House or the business of the House, you know, it should be considered an honor, you know, to have a member of your party take on such a position. And the issue of overall governance and good governance should be the predominant consideration in issues like that. But he winds up the article in saying, in that bold, no-nonsense, dramatic, long mamanu, I therefore say, Messieurs, wangez kozot, achilot zot. Parfait kozot hot. In loose translation, gentlemen, get yourself together. Quit embarrassing yourselves. I am only left to say that as his first outing, Prime Minister Chasney handled the delicate situation with consummate aplomb.
Was that his translation or the editor's note?
I think that's his translation. But there's also the other article on the Sarah flood issue. Is the SLP still gunning for ex-sister Sarah? I'm not sure what the connection is between the two issues, but your take on the deputy issue.
Well, Mr. Snack is one whose interpretations and definitions and his take on historical incidents is always one worthy of reading, listening to, watching. He has the unique history of having served on both sides of the House in one session, across the floor. He was able to justify that crossing of the floor in the name of good governance. He didn't see anything wrong with crossing over to the party that those who elected him voted against. That being said, he's also one of those individuals who is very rich in his understanding of the history of our politics. And he has always found ways, like I've said time and time again, to leave the Snack brand on the politics. His brother served as Prime Minister. He served as leader of the opposition. He served as a councillor in the city council, and there's some history in that a new mayor is going to be appointed next week. And one of the most memorable things about Mr. Snack as a councillor was that for every city council election that he would be contesting, the deposit, if the deposit was $100, he would deposit it in 110 cents pieces. You know, I wasn't never sure whether it was to just give the young ladies counting the money work, or whether it was him dishing out the collections of a tin pan. But coming over to the current issue, I think the issue of Deputy Speaker is one which Mr. Snack colorfully described as a recurrent stupidity surrounding the office of the Deputy Speaker. And it might sound simple to say, well, all right, what's wrong with having a Deputy Speaker? What's all the fuss about which party does? The Labour Party is saying it is taken by tradition and it is not going to exercise the option because it's not required legally. The government has an interesting argument because the Prime Minister has said one thing that has two interpretations, and that is that the House doesn't need a Deputy Speaker in order to function. The Constitution, what the constitutionalists are telling me is that the Constitution says in effect that you have to have a Deputy Speaker to be elected at the first sitting of the House. With that being said, there are some lawyers who interpret that to mean that the Deputy Speaker is only to be elected for the first sitting. This is one of the arguments being used to justify the government not appointing a Deputy Speaker. There is also another interpretation which said, what's the use of a Deputy Speaker? The Deputy Speaker's role is only to hold on for the Speaker in his or her absence, whether he or she has gone to the toilet or to lunch or is overseas or unavailable. But that is not a role that is prescribed and expected with every sitting. So one view that was offered to me is that the Prime Minister could, for example, say to the Madam Speaker right now, in the same way that you adjourn the House for 10 minutes during the first session to allow me to go and discuss with the leader of the opposition. Should the need arise and you have to excuse yourself for whatever reasons, you can adjourn for 10 minutes or 15 minutes as you see fit and come back. At the end of the day, there is still another view among lawyers which says that when constitutions are written, the intent is not to leave interpretation to the speculation of individuals. That if the Constitution says you have to have a Deputy Speaker from the very first day one has to be elected, there must be a reason for that, and the reason has to be that there ought always to be present a Deputy Speaker in case of an emergency arising, so that the business of the House will not have to be adjourned. So now that the government and the Prime Minister, in his wisdom, or in keeping with the best advice given to him, has decided that he is going to appoint the Deputy Speaker to the Cabinet of Ministers, and her having had to resign the position that she had less than a month ago been appointed to. Somebody asked me if she earned a monthly salary already. But what all of this points to is the strong indication, more likely than not, that the Prime Minister will have to reshuffle his cabinet again. Because all of the 11 MPs are within the cabinet, and the Deputy Speaker must be an MP. And if the opposition insists that it is not going to do what it is not legally required or constitutionally required to do, then it would mean that the Prime Minister will have to reshuffle his cabinet and somebody will have to step down. I understand that Mr. Peter Josie has indicated that in his view the Prime Minister is wrong on the interpretation, and that he will have to appoint one of his 11 MPs as deputy speaker. He recommended the MP for Soufriere. I understand that didn't go down well with the his supporters in Soufriere. But Mr. Josie's position is one that I also share, that the Prime Minister has no choice but to reshuffle his cabinet and disappoint somebody who was recently appointed.
What about this idea of the interpretation? You mentioned earlier about the interpretation, the use of the word convenience. There seems to be a debate about that as well. And I know when it comes to matters like that, you cannot just take the words for the ordinary meaning. There's a legal definition.
It was used?
Let me find the relevant paragraph here.
But the context.
It is the House, therefore, meaning a simple majority of the quorum present. In this regard, a simple majority of the House is infallible with or without the consent of the opposition. The constitutional rule after the nomination has been made and seconded by the government under the usual circumstances in existing. Where is it?
But what's the argument?
The
about interpretation.
Yeah, whether it is
whose convenience.
Okay, we have another sitting of Parliament scheduled for August. At which point the argument is, should a deputy speaker
not be appointed
at that point? You know, or do we go with the interpretation that at the convenience of the government, meaning a subsequent sitting, or does it have to be at the next sitting?
Okay, that is one of the arguments that the lawyers are using, that where the Constitution would say something like at the convenience, it ought not to be interpreted that in the convenience there would mean at the whims and fancies, like or dislike, whether you like it or not, but convenience meaning what is best for the House at the time, what is best for the circumstances, and not necessarily what Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker feels is best, whether you like it or not. The personality of the Speaker is one. I remember Mr. St. Clair Daniel. Mr. St. Clair Daniel was Speaker of his House, whether you like it or not. He would rule, and he would tell you why he ruling, and etc., etc. You'd have other less direct speakers, Mr. Baden-Alain from Soufriere, who would seek as much as possible to have consensus, even if it is known which party he supports, but would try to, as much as possible, disguise that. The president of the last Senate, that is not necessarily what can be said about him insofar as trying not to give any impression where he stands. So it depends on the personality, and that is why I think constitutional writers would be careful to use words that they would expect the people interpreting them to know that no judicial body would want to give an individual the right to be a dictator. What I say goes whether you like it or not in a democracy, in a house where I'm supposed to be given balance. That at the convenience of the government or of the Speaker, in that instance, ought to be interpreted as what is most convenient for the smooth running of the House or for the smooth running of the country. In this instance, I think at the convenience of the government ought to be interpreted as at what is best for the smooth running of the House. And it cannot be said that the House will be running smooth if there is a position called Deputy Speaker, which is a constitutional requirement in that same constitution, and yet you're going to see that filling that post is at the convenience of the Prime Minister or the government or the Speaker. That's my humble layman's interpretation of the law.
But speaking of dictators, when we come back, and we do for a break, when we come back, I want us to shift our focus to what's happening over in Turkey and developments with the media over there. This is the Press Cup. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We want to shift our focus to an international development, I guess, that's also affecting the media. In news this week, we heard that the Turkish government's news media shut down. We have government that's ordered 131 newspapers, news agencies, publishers, television, radio stations to close down. That's after a coup attempt in Turkey, which we've discussed on a previous program. The decree orders the closure of 45 newspapers, 15 magazines, 16 TV channels, 23 stations, 3 news agencies, and 29 publishers and distributors. Among them, several daily newspapers and the news agencies as well. Earlier on July 27, media reported that an Istanbul prosecutor had issued an arrest warrant for, I think, 45 or 49 journalists, media workers and executives who worked for one of the newspapers over there. Something that had been predicted immediately after the developments in Turkey. But it raises a lot of questions about how paranoid Erdogan is, or how legitimate some of his concerns are, as far as how widespread and deep-seated this opposition to him is in Turkey.
I don't think, I don't subscribe to either of those views. I don't think Erdogan is paranoid, and I don't think, what's the second one?
The coup.
I don't think that. I think what has happened is that, and I've been studying Turkey over the years, ever since NATO moved to establish its base on the Turkish border with Syria. From way back when, I had predicted that that is going to develop border problems between Syria and Turkey with the NATO presence, which, again, the biggest force in NATO is the United States. And the Arab world would have seen the establishment of the NATO base on the Turkish border as a move by Erdogan to allow him to be in a position for Turkey to have more reasons to pursue the Kurds across the border. As he has done in the case of Iraq, as he has done in every case bordering Turkey where the Kurds, the armed Kurds, have taken refuge. That came to pass. The NATO thing was established, and what we have seen in the period since the last big shake-up in Turkey, if you remember, it was an environmental issue where the government had decided around the Arab Spring time that it was going to transform that park into an industrial zone, and there was lots of protests, and the police and the protesters clashed. People died, people were arrested, etc. From that point, there developed a deep crack within Erdogan's party, because at the time the president was Abdullah Gül, and because of the crackdown on Twitter, Facebook, and the other instant media, which, remember, they all played a significant role in mobilization in the Arab Spring. And they were being used to mobilize protests against Erdogan during that protest in defense of the park, which spread to many cities. The president, Abdullah Gül, publicly disagreed with the then Prime Minister, Erdogan, when the Prime Minister took the decision to ban Twitter. And that was the very first time that the two, who couldn't have been closer for Erdogan to have selected him to be president. Immediately after that, Erdogan started to, Abdullah Gül, the president, started to disappear, and the prime minister moved to have a constitutional rearrangement to shift, to do away, first of all, with the executive power lying with the president, and putting it to the prime minister, and eventually doing away with the prime minister being the head of the government, making it the president, which he has become now, with a prime minister who has a more minimal role than when Mr. Erdogan, was prime minister. Observers in Europe, in the Arab world, because Turkey is at that transition point between the Arab world and Europe, and with Turkey looking to enter into the European Union, Erdogan has put that on hold over the refugee crisis. And in the last year or two, he has been accused by friends and foe alike, critics at home and abroad, of supervising the quick transition of Turkey from a democracy into a dictatorship, with him as the unchallenged supremo insofar as power is concerned.
That's why I raised the issue of the paranoia, because wasn't this coup attempt almost a blessing in disguise, because now it gives him an opportunity to justify exactly what you say, to solidify his position as a dictator.
But I don't think it is as much as a result of, again, it might depend on our interpretation of paranoia. I don't think it's because he's afraid, but more because he's smart enough to see it as an opportunity to get rid of every single person.
And he has been doing
and
that.
He's been, I mean, the
Judges,
man set up,
civil
the man
servants.
set up 1-800 numbers, the equivalent of 1-800 numbers, and say anybody could call and say you suspect that person is supporting the guy who's in Gulen, who's in the United States.
1-800 snitch.
Yeah, 1-800 snitch. And I mean, most of the people being picked up after the first day, 8,000 policemen and soldiers get put aside. Now it's in the tens of thousands.
And now you have the media now, which would be challenging and exposing those issues.
26 radio stations, 40-something newspapers, 80-something journalists. They have warrants out for them. I watch them bringing in some 40-something journalists. And what's their charge? They are in league with the coup plotter. So I think that the coup gave Erdogan the opportunity, and he seized it to clamp down. He's put the European project on hold. The European Foreign Minister Federica Mogherini says that you can't be a member of NATO and have the death penalty. All he's done is introduce an emergency during which you can't tell no government don't have a death penalty during an emergency. And he's going to determine how long that emergency lasts. Which I can foresee being a very long time, and therefore he's going to break some necks or shoot some bullets into some heads to send a message to not just the guy in the United States, not just his supporters in Turkey, because that guy is a religious figure who historically was also a very close friend of Erdogan. But his approach to politics is to feed his way into the state machinery, to have his people in there as sleepers, like, jihadists, ISIS sleepers, and have them wake up one day. But he doesn't have a political party or a political force, which is absolutely necessary if one wants to have political power of a democratic nature, or even of any nature. I mean, politics, a party is needed to run any machinery, whether it's in a dictatorship or a democracy. The two are not the same, but parties are the driving forces in politics.
Yeah, we're talking about parties in the driving forces in politics, but I mean, in the overall global context, looking at developments in the EU, is it worth it in the long run?
To what? To have a party?
To sever ties or to risk the relationship that you've established with the EU, for instance?
Oh, no, I mean, Erdogan and with that. The size of Turkey, when you hear about tens of thousands of police officers alone arrested, dismissed, etc. The size of the country and its economic wealth, which analysts point out is based more on loans and credit than on actual production and income. But under Erdogan and his party, Turkey has industrialized in a tremendous way in Europe. And given the fact that NATO troops are in Turkey on the border with Syria, Erdogan is a smart guy who has been able to effectively trap Europe, the United States and NATO into agreements that he could exercise strength to reduce on their testicular fortitude. From the standpoint, yeah, he could squeeze their balls.
Does he remind you of anybody?
Yeah, well, no, not really right now. No, but he's done that. NATO, led by the United States, can't quarrel with him because the NATO nuclear-powered stuff is on his border, insofar as Syria is concerned. The United States, he's accusing the United States of being behind the coup simply because the guy he accuses of being behind the coup is based in Philadelphia.
That's Fethullah Gulen?
Yeah, Gulen. So because the guy is based in the United States and he has asked for them to repatriate the guy for him to break his neck, Secretary of State Kerry said, listen, there's a procedure, send us the proof and we will comply if you convince us. One would expect that Erdogan has sent what he considers to be proof, but obviously it has not convinced Washington. And on that basis, he is accusing not just Washington, State Department and U.S. government, he's also now accusing the U.S. military on Turkish soil, at the NATO base, of doing and saying things that amount to less than cooperation within NATO. So Erdogan
you still think that's paranoia?
Well, my thing about paranoia, my interpretation of paranoia is one where you're so afraid you're doing things that are making sense. Everything Erdogan doing, they're making sense for him, you know.
Yeah, but
he's coming out stronger.
It might be a little bit of both.
Well, yeah. Well, you mean he's acted into flexing his muscles on the basis of his fear of being flexed out by bigger muscles?
But I look at him and I see a lot of similarities between him and Putin as far as the strategic thinking.
Oh yeah, the strategic thinking thing. But I would put him closer to some other guys who are no longer around. One can only hope that, and again, St. Lucia has diplomatic relations with Turkey. Turkey is present in the Caribbean. Turkey is saying to the United States, irrespective of our quarrel, let us cooperate in the fight against ISIS. But the difference here is that while the United States is talking to Russia about cooling off and cooperating to reduce on the level of deaths in the Syrian conflict, Turkey is not willing to cooperate, even to sit at a table and speak to Assad. And Turkey has been accused by Russia, by Assad, and by other Arab states of cooperating with ISIL on RT. I've seen documentaries where RT teams have gone into Turkey and filmed what they purport to be ISIS camps, because they have ISIS flags flying over them within Turkish territory. Vladimir Putin himself, after Turkey shut down the Russian plane, accused Turkey of dealing with ISIS by virtue of buying oil from ISIS, oil that is being stolen in Syria and Iraq by ISIS, that Turkey is buying the oil in order to fund and enrich an ISIS so that ISIS could be a more potent force against the Syrians. So again, I think Erdogan is more smart than afraid, more tactical than foolish. One of the things that Putin will never be forgotten for, I think he was the first world leader who announced that he was divorcing his wife to marry the state. And that was because you're allowed 2 terms in Russia, but a term is 6 years. So he agreed, I'll take the 2 terms, I'll spend my 12 years, but he chose the guy who is going to be the president for the next term, and he became prime minister. So he was the backseat driver, reminds me of somebody in our history. And after the 6 years in opposition, he came back on, and he's the most popular president that Russia has ever had today, particularly after the Ukraine situation and the annexing of Crimea. Now Putin is being accused of being the one organizing the leaks in the Democratic camp, and he's being accused of influencing who is going to be the next president, because Trump has said that he can deal with Putin and he can deal with the Chinese. So the Democrats are accusing Putin of backing Trump, accusing the Russians of hacking their computers to prove that the Clinton campaign was very much more than just against Sanders. And at the end of the day, Putin is nothing but smiling. I was reading this morning, he gave an interview to the US, the ABC breakfast thing, where he said something to the effect that there may be more than just speculation about my involvement. And Putin speaks perfect English.
We're due for a break, our final one, and when we come back, we'll wrap up. This is the Press Club with me, Kendall Burton, and Earl Bousquet. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before we wrap up, it would be remiss of us if we didn't touch on Emancipation Day celebrations, which coming up on Monday, August 1st. The Voice newspaper has a pretty interesting, as they always do, Emancipation Day supplement in the paper. And I always recommend, as I will do now, that our students find these, collect them, keep them together. I think they're a lot of good information in there. The Star has a very interesting article in there as well. A couple of them. The Zong incident revisited. A little bit of history here. You familiar with that story?
No.
It's referencing a ship called the Zong, in which the captain, on the way back to the Caribbean, encountered a situation where a lot of the slaves fell sick, and he himself fell sick and had to dump 130 of them overboard. But in terms of Emancipation Day activities, I haven't heard anything significant happening, and it makes you wonder, about the relevance, the continued relevance of the day.
Yeah, we continue to be a society that is so distracted by events at home and abroad, the effect of not just radio, television, and the traditional media, but social media. People have more things to think about, more things to worry about, there are more distractions, and therefore there's less tendency to do what you've just done. You do it once a year. Remind people to read, and particularly students to pick up and collect, etc. How many people are doing it? And between Emancipation Days, how much of that is happening? Teachers, some selected few, your Nkrumah Lucien and others, who have a vested interest in ensuring that we know from whence we cometh, would do it on a regular basis. And what I'm saying here is that while the society has quote-unquote moved forward, while it has quote-unquote progressed, while we have quote-unquote developed, that has come at the expense of our will, our ability, and the encouragement to learn more about emancipation, about slavery, etc. The difference between last Emancipation Day and now is a big one. David Cameron is no longer the Prime Minister of Britain. What are the consequences for us? What are the consequences for CARICOM's move to... because CARICOM, I do know that CARICOM as a grouping wrote a collective letter to Prime Minister David Cameron saying, listen, let's talk about these 10 points of reparatory justice that we want to discuss with Britain, France, and all of the other countries that benefited from slavery.
But do you get the impression that, because as I'm reading this article here this morning, I'm thinking to myself, and do you get the impression that slavery is something that Caribbean people just want to forget and put behind them? And that is why emancipation gets
it might very well be so.
It's not so much that it's distracted.
It might very well be so, but that would be a sorry situation. I would think that if that is so, it is because we do not know. And you know, unlike you can't tell the Jews to put the Holocaust behind them. Because they've gone through a process of ensuring that between 1948 and today, every Jew understands and knows what was the cost and the effect of the Holocaust on them as...
And that's what I think is lacking
and
here.
that is what is lacking. Slavery was the worst crime against humanity ever recorded. But it's the Jews who have said never again. We haven't said never again in terms of the survivors of the victims of slavery. The whole question as to who are the victims of slaves. Because we would tend to say it is only black people who have been victims of slavery. Slavery was a system, it wasn't a race. And therefore there were white people who were victims of slavery in other means than having licks on their back, because you know they had to ship young white people down to the islands to serve the white people like themselves, and you know, hundreds of and thousands of them died as a result of the diseases that they couldn't handle. So that is why the only activities you will hear about for Emancipation Day over the last 5 years would be the annual lecture sponsored by the Cultural Development Foundation at the studio of NTN and GIS, which is going to take place on the 1st, on Tuesday, on Monday, the holiday. Also in Labrie, there is going to be another Freedom Mass, which is their own interpretation and definition of how to celebrate the joyous parts of our history and emancipation. Short of that, we have the National Reparations Committee, which I chair, and which has been accused of being comatose ever since it has been established. I can happily announce that the committee will be meeting on Wednesdays, and we have a very significant program for August the 17th, which is the birthday of Marcus Garvey. We are working with the open campus at the University of the West Indies, along with the principal of the University of the West Indies, Hilary Beckles, who is also the chairman of the CARICOM Regional Commission. I cannot give details yet as to what is going to be. Some of these details will be revealed on Emancipation Day itself. All I can say, folks, is that prepare for August the 17th. There's going to be a very big one right here, in which quite a lot is going to happen.
Okay, and that's it for us. We're out of time. Mr. Buske, as usual, thank you for being here. Thanks for watching. God willing, we'll be back here next week with another program, and you'll join us then. Have a good weekend.